Between 1982 and 1988, Iraq was engaged in a costly war with Iran. Iraq was backed and heavily funded by neighboring emirate Kuwait, eventually borrowing more than $60 billion from the Kuwaiti government. After the war, Iraq was devastated economically, while Kuwait's economy was thriving. Iraq's main source of income, oil exportation, was threatened by Kuwait's insistence on the overproduction of oil, driving the price of crude very low. With the price of oil so low, Iraq could not earn enough money to repay its debt to Kuwait. Iraq asked for Kuwait to forgive their war debts, but Kuwait declined. Saddam Hussein, angered by Kuwait's unwillingness to back off of oil production and to forgive Iraq's debts, accused Kuwait of slant drilling across the border between the two countries, stealing Iraq's oil for themselves. In the pre-dawn hours of August 2, 1990, President Saddam Hussein of Iraq ordered an army of more than 100,000 soldiers and 700 tanks to cross the Iraqi border into Kuwait. As this force descended on Kuwait City from two directions, the city was bombed from the air and attacked from the sea by soldiers delivered ashore from boats and helicopters. After 2 days of fighting, Kuwait was overrun and the Iraqi occupation began.
To all intents and purposes, Kuwait has ceased to exist as an independent sovereign nation. And with one stroke, Saddam Hussein and Iraq have eliminated billions of dollars worth of debts, acquired enormous oil resources on top of those already controlled, gained access to an important Persian Gulf port, and intimidated every other country in the region. It is difficult to find anyone with a good word to say about Iraq and its dictator, but it is equally difficult to find anyone putting forward realistic countermeasures that could force Iraqi troops out of Kuwait before they are good and ready to leave. For the moment, then, as Jackie Judd reports, Hussein appears to have gambled and won. Big.
Within 12 hours of the assault, Iraq had installed itself as an occupying force in the capital. Kuwait, outnumbered 50-1 on the battlefield, never stood a chance. Reporter Carol Murphy described the mayhem outside of her hotel.
The fighting started this morning around 5:30 near the city. We could hear long-range artillery, and then there was sporadic street fighting, machine gun fire and artillery shells, mainly at the Palace of the Emir, which is just across the street from the hotel and the American Embassy.
The situation inside Kuwait is serious.
On August 8, 1990, Saddam announced his intention to abolish the border with Kuwait and annex most of Kuwait as Iraq's 19th province. He dissolved the Emiri government and appointed his cousin, known to most of us as Chemical Ali, to be military governor of the province of Kuwait. A campaign was immediately underway to erase Kuwait's national identity by destroying its landmarks and cultural centers, and by changing the name of Kuwait City to Al-Qadima. Iraqi troops were permitted and encouraged to loot and vandalize all public and private property, and to maltreat, even kill, anyone suspected of remaining loyal to Kuwaiti sovereignty and opposing the annexation. The looting and vandalism began on August 2nd and lasted till the day of the retreat and surrender nearly 7 months later. No place was spared, whether in the city or in a village, as homes, hospitals, schools, mosques, businesses, amusement parks, hotels, and public buildings were plundered, smeared with Iraqi graffiti, and sprayed with bullets inside and outside. The National Archives and newspaper archives were completely destroyed. Computers, appliances, toys, street lamps, boats, vehicles, and even airplanes were taken. What was unwanted or untransportable was smashed or ignited. Kuwait University and other schools were stripped bare of everything from blackboards to desks to paperclips to bookshelves to screws in the walls. At the sports stadiums, even the seats were removed. In January 1991, a coalition of forces led by the United States began an air campaign against Iraq. In February, a ground campaign was launched.
Yesterday, after conferring with my senior national security advisors and following extensive consultations with our coalition partners, Saddam Hussein was given one last chance, set forth in very explicit terms to do what he should have done more than 6 months ago: withdraw from Kuwait without condition or further delay and comply fully with the resolutions passed by the United Nations Security Council. What we have seen is a redoubling of Saddam Hussein's efforts to destroy completely Kuwait and its people. I have therefore directed General Norman Schwarzkopf, in conjunction with coalition forces, to use all forces available, including ground forces, to eject the Iraqi army from Kuwait.
On February 26, 1991, Iraqi forces began their retreat along the same routes that they had used to invade Kuwait. Saddam Hussein ordered his troops to use scorched earth tactics, resulting in the largest and most devastating act of environmental vandalism ever recorded. Oil wells were set ablaze, oil lakes were created on the surface of the desert, and millions of barrels of oil were drained into the Persian Gulf, destroying delicate marine habitats.
In retaliation for the coalition's continuous aerial bombardment, Saddam Hussein unleashed a new kind of destruction. He ordered the Iraqi army to blow up the oil fields of Kuwait. It created scenes of apocalyptic devastation.
It looks like what I envisioned hell would look like. The country of Kuwait is burning.
Hundreds of wells were blown up, sending a wall of flame and smoke thousands of feet into the air. Pipelines were ruptured, storage tanks exploded, and huge lakes of oil pooled in the desert sand. Choking black clouds filled the air, and day turned to night as the smoke blocked out the sun.
The smoke from the fires covered the entire country in a haze that lasted for more than 7 months. The oil lakes created an almost asphalt-like surface in the sand, which to this day cannot be cleaned. Many of Kuwait's famous pearl fisheries were destroyed and never recovered. By the end of February 1991, Iraqi forces had pulled out of Kuwait, and President Bush declared that Kuwait had been liberated. Kuwait immediately began to rebuild their broken nation. 20 years later, relations between Iraq and Kuwait remain somewhat strained. However, the ouster and death of Saddam Hussein has led to some tentative steps in renewing their once strong relationship.
Football, cause for national pride. But at this match between Iraq and Kuwait, there are memories of a rivalry that goes far beyond the pitch. And while the era of Saddam Hussein, the man who ordered the invasion of Kuwait, is now over, the impact of his move is anything but.
Kuwait, of course, was traumatized by the invasion in 1990, 20 years ago now, and it has yet to overcome the fear that Iraq will yet again want to show that Kuwait is the 19th province rather than an independent neighboring state. And Kuwait will want some kind of guarantees that the past will not be repeated.
The Iraqi government has offered assurances that the new Iraq is no longer a threat to the world. But there are other issues, including demarcating the two countries' maritime borders in the Gulf, missing persons and property, locating more than 1,000 missing persons or their remains, and for Iraq to return Kuwaiti government documents that went missing during the invasion. Another issue, and perhaps the most contentious, is war reparations. Iraq has paid Kuwait around $30 billion to date, and Kuwait says it's still owed more than $20 billion. That money would come from Iraq's main income, oil revenues. Iraq believes it has paid enough and says it's still trying to recover from years of war.
We do need each and every penny that we do need it for reconstruction of our distracted country. Iraq is fully distracted, and the money at this time, now 10 years, till 2020, we do need the money because Iraqi people in need for huge services.
Many Iraqis who suffered the dark days of Saddam Hussein-era sanctions feel they have been punished twice, by their former dictator and by his actions. Now, 20 years on, a move toward improving the strained ties between Iraq and Kuwait. In the biggest symbolic step yet, Kuwait's Prime Minister visited Baghdad on Wednesday. the highest-ranking Kuwaiti visit since the invasion. The two sides agreed to work bilaterally on resolving outstanding issues, and Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki is expected to make a visit to Kuwait soon.
Now we see a thaw of sorts. We'll have to see how far it goes with mutual exchanges of government leaders. And that could lead to a peace treaty of some sort, or because there are a number of outstanding issues that need to be resolved. But all of them are resolvable, and I think if the political will is there, it can be done.
Analysts say while there are signs of progress being made, the real issue is essentially a lack of trust on both sides, and building that trust will not be easy. Jumana Karache, CNN, Baghdad.
They were on active duty in 1990, but this group of Iraqi veterans insist even they didn't see the invasion of Kuwait coming. It was a war waged by Saddam's Republican Guards, say these veterans. Those who wanted out were threatened by death squads.
That war was just wrong. Saddam wanted to make up for his failures by starting yet another conflict. It's like he wanted to alter reality. What can I say but that he was a sick man? They should not have sentenced him to death. He should have died a slow, painful death.
Today, very few Iraqis would openly support Saddam's invasion of Kuwait in 1990. The majority seem to think it was a grave mistake for which they paid a very high price.
That price included heavy civilian casualties. At the Amriya shelter, more than 400 people, mainly women and children, died when the bunker was hit by American laser-guided smart bombs during Operation Desert Storm in February 1991. And though many Iraqis today say they're trying to put the past behind them, the present is not exactly forgiving. Iraqi officials say relations with Kuwait remain stormy as the neighboring emirate continues to seek billions of dollars of war reparations from Baghdad.
The Iraqi people should not still be paying for the price of one man's decision. We think it's only fair for our brothers in Kuwait to consider that. As we look toward the future, there's no progress, and we're still unable to resolve outstanding issues, including debt. We feel there's a moral commitment stemming from brotherhood and neighbourly relations.
Considerations some argue that were tossed aside when Kuwait insisted on going after Iraqi Airways, which it accuses of seizing aircraft from the Kuwaiti national carrier during the war. The result was a court battle that saw the Iraqi airline being declared bankrupt in May. It now only operates flights locally and to a few regional countries, a move that has hampered Iraqi attempts to reach out to the world through international flights. Iraqi officials say Kuwait may be missing out on lucrative investment opportunities as a result. Baghdad has awarded several huge oil contracts which it can't service logistically, and officials say as a backdoor neighbor, Kuwait should be capitalizing through its network of oil contractors dealing with spare parts and catering. But for war veteran Mahmoud Kazim, what Iraq really needs from Kuwait is much simpler.
Friendship, and for the brotherhood to return.
Al Jazeera, Baghdad.
In the early 1990s, mainstream media was dominated by the three major networks, CNN and the New York Times newspaper. For all intents and purposes, the Internet as we know it today did not exist, allowing the U.S. government to actively spin propaganda pieces to sell the war to the American public. Many people believed that the news media would behave as they did during the Vietnam War, analyzing and sometimes even criticizing the war. However, regulations imposed by the Bush administration limited the press's access and helped create an official reality of combat that had little to do with facts on the ground.
Jeff Cohen is a journalism professor at Ithaca College, a media critic, and also founded Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. Jeff, so much to reflect upon as we come up on this 20-year anniversary. Despite the success that it's been called, it was also this war where protesters enlisted a phrase unfamiliar to so many. No blood for oil, they said. Protesters, of course, an unfamiliar sight during this time. I remember yellow ribbons on lapels, bumper stickers, even on trees. Now, I want to get your retrospective take on that first Gulf War.
Well, you're describing a war where propaganda in the U.S. media system was really successful, because when scholars and academics and researchers looked back on it, even a year or two later, we realized that most of the things that the American people believed about the war were false. You know, hour after hour on CNN and other TV news channels, we were told about this amazing new weapon called the Patriot missile that could shoot Iraqi missiles out of the sky. It was largely a hoax. We learned later that it had been a near total failure. You know, we were told hour after hour during the Gulf War 20 years ago about this new smart bomb technology, laser guided, it didn't hit civilians, and then we learned after the war, after all the propaganda was done, we learned that it was a tiny percentage of bombs that were smart bomb technology. And there were hoaxes that goaded the American public into supporting the war in the first place that the media played big. And the most classic hoax was the 300 Kuwaiti babies that were allegedly taken out of incubators and killed so that the incubators could be sent back to Iraq. It was a total falsehood. Kuwaiti medical people were telling international journalists the truth. It turned out later that it was a PR firm working with the Kuwaiti government that concocted the hoax. They had a young girl speaking as having been a witness to the incubator killings, and it turns out she was like the daughter of an embassy official. So one propaganda piece after another.
Well, I'm wondering then, Jeff, what interest did the U.S. media have back then in, putting that propaganda forth?
They always want to seem patriotic. U.S. corporate media are very close to the U.S. political state. And there's this coherence of interest. I remember Tom Brokaw, the NBC anchor at the time, almost proclaiming in glee about the Patriot missile. He said, "This is the missile that put the Iraqi Scud missile in its place." Well, Tom Brokaw was an employee then of General Electric, which owns NBC. General Electric made parts for the Patriot missile. The Patriot missile was a complete failure, but in the propaganda that came out from TV networks, not just NBC, but the others, it was turned into a total success. It's a problem where U.S. journalists are just too cozy with the state. We don't have a state media here, but sometimes it looks like we do.